I want you to close your eyes for a second. Just picture this. Imagine you are standing on the white sands of Botany Bay. It is April 1770. The air is thick, it's humid, maybe you can hear the birds.
Birds that probably sound completely alien compared to anything you'd hear in Europe.
Exactly, totally alien. And you are watching two worlds collide. But here's the thing, and this is really the hook for today's deep dive. They aren't just crashing into each other in space. They are crashing into each other in time.
That is quite the visual to start with. You're talking about the arrival of the HMS Endeavour, right? Captain James Cook?
Right, Captain Cook. On one side, you have Cook. And think about what he actually represents. He isn't just a guy on a boat. He's like the poster child for the European Enlightenment. He's got Newton's physics in his head. He's navigating with the absolute most advanced technologies of the 18th century. And he is backed by the massive churning engine of burgeoning capitalism.
On the Royal Navy, of course.
Yeah, exactly. The whole weight of the British Empire.
Right. And on the shore, watching this massive wooden beast drop anchor, are the Guigal people. They are Aboriginal Australians living in a hunter-gatherer society. They are using tools made of stone, bone, wood. They're deeply connected to the land through the Dreamtime, which is this spiritual cosmology that is ancient and incredibly complex.
Very complex.
But socially and technologically, they are living in what Europeans at the time would have called the Stone Age.
And this is where we usually get the standard history lesson. Colonialism is bad, conquest is brutal. And yes, all of that is true. We aren't disputing that at all. But today, we are going a lot deeper.
We are.
We're looking at a stack of sources that argue this wasn't just a meeting of different cultures. It was a collision of two completely different timelines.
Yeah, and this is the core concept of today's deep dive. We're going to explore the idea of the non-simultaneous unfolding of history. It is a bit of a mouthful, I know, but it is a fascinating concept. It's based heavily on the philosophy of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel.
Hegel. The heavy hitter.
The heavyweight champion of German philosophy, yeah. Basically, the argument from our sources is this. If you take advanced Western ideas, things like democracy, property rights, or the nation state, and you just drop them onto a society that hasn't lived through the specific history that created those ideas.
You don't get progress.
Right, you don't.
You get distortion. You get a total mess.
Exactly. And to understand why modern nation building fails or why democracy struggles in places like Pakistan, which we will definitely get to later, we have to start right there on that beach in 1770.
So let's unpack this encounter at the edge of the world. Because when we say Stone Age versus Enlightenment, it almost sounds like we're making a judgment about intelligence, like Cook was smart and the locals weren't.
And that is absolutely the wrong way to read it.
Totally.
The sources are very clear on this point. It is not about intelligence. It is about historical trajectory and material conditions. The Aboriginal society was perfectly adapted to its environment. They had sophisticated astronomy, complex laws, and a real mastery of ecology. But because Australia is geographically isolated and lacks domesticable animals or crops.
Right, you can't farm, you can't build a surplus of food.
Exactly. And without an agricultural surplus, you don't get cities. You don't get centralized states. You don't get the specialized division of labor or the social hierarchy that eventually leads to things like written constitutions or bureaucracies. Meanwhile, Cook's world had gone through the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution.
They had been fighting brutal wars over sovereignty and rights for centuries at that point.
Right. Those concepts, sovereignty, individual rights, private property, they were forged in the fires of European history. They didn't just appear out of thin air. So when Cook plants the British flag in the sand, he thinks he is doing something universal. He is claiming territory based on abstract European laws.
But to the people standing on the beach, that flag is completely meaningless.
It's actually worse than meaningless. It is a metaphysical error. You have the British idea of lock-in ownership, the idea that you own land by fencing it off and mixing your labor with it, and you are slamming that up against an indigenous reality where the land is sacred, communal, and holds the literal history of their ancestors.
So Hegel would say these two groups are in the same year, 1770, but they aren't in the same time.
Precisely. That is the non-simultaneity. And the tragedy, according to our sources, is that you cannot just transplant the software of the Enlightenment onto the hardware of a hunter-gatherer society. It just doesn't compute. It leads to dispossession and cultural erosion because the receiving society has no structure to absorb these alien forms.
This idea of alien forms is really the thread we're going to pull on today. Because it didn't just stop in 1770. This happens over and over again throughout history. And interestingly, Hegel didn't just apply this critique to colonies. He applied it to Europe itself.
He did. And this is where the story gets really dramatic. To understand why importing freedom rarely works, we have to look at the French Revolution.
Now, I love this specific detail from our notes. Hegel wasn't always this, grumpy old philosopher writing dense books. When he was young, he was actually a bit of a radical fanboy of the French Revolution, wasn't he?
He was. There is this famous story of a young Hegel, along with the poet Hölderlin and the philosopher Schelling, going out and planting a liberty tree in a marketplace to celebrate the French Revolution. They were ecstatic. They thought, finally, reason is triumphing over all that old, dusty feudalism.
They thought they could just declare freedom and it would magically happen overnight.
Right. They thought they could sweep away the kings and the priests and instantly install universal liberty. But then the terror happened, the guillotine, the absolute chaos, and Hegel really had to ask himself why. Why did this beautiful, rational idea turn into a bloodbath?
And what was his answer to that?
His answer was that the French Jacobins tried to install abstract freedom immediately. They wanted to skip the steps.
Skip the steps. What do you mean by that?
Well, Hegel argues that history is the labor of the negative. It is a struggle. You have to work through contradictions over time. The French revolutionaries tried to dissolve all the mediating institutions, the church, the guilds, the local traditions, the family structures. They wanted a direct line between the individual and the state.
But without those buffers in place.
Without those buffers, without that ethical life, or Sittlichkeit, as Hegel calls it in German, freedom is just an empty shell. It becomes tyrannical. You can't just write freedom on a piece of paper and expect a society that has been feudal for 1,000 years to suddenly act like a perfectly modern republic.
That's such a powerful insight. You really can't just legislate a mindset.
You cannot. You have to undergo the struggle to build it organically. And this is the perfect bridge to colonialism. Because if the French Revolution was a domestic mistake of trying to force history to speed up, colonialism was the international export of that exact same mistake.
The sources talk about the British Empire effectively becoming a delivery system for abstract modernity.
That is a great way to put it. Think about the British Raj in India, which included what is now modern-day Pakistan. The British came in and they brought the hardware of modernity. They laid down railways. They strung up telegraph wires across the subcontinent. They built courts that looked exactly like the ones back in London.
And they had this very explicit goal, right? There is that famous quote from Macaulay, the British reformer.
Yes, Thomas Macaulay. He explicitly said the goal was to create a class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect.
Talk about hubris.
It is the ultimate Enlightenment hubris. He actually believed that you could just swap out the software of an entire civilization. But here is the massive problem. The society in India at the time was agrarian, deeply religious, and often organized tribally or by caste. It hadn't gone through the Protestant Reformation. It hadn't gone through the Industrial Revolution. It hadn't organically developed the bourgeois consciousness that makes a Westminster Parliament actually function.
So you end up with these forms, a parliament, a high court, a ballot box, just sitting on top of a society that operates on completely different older rules.
Exactly. The source material calls this hybridity without synthesis. The forms mask the reality. You have a judge wearing a traditional British wig, but the people in the courtroom are operating on ancient kinship loyalties, not abstract individual rights. And this brings us to the most provocative part of our source material today, the modern Muslim world, and specifically Pakistan.
Yeah, the sources really don't pull any punches here. They argue that a lot of the dysfunction we see in places like Pakistan today is a direct result of this non-simultaneity.
It is a tough analysis, but let's follow the logic they present. Hegel famously and controversially described the Orient as being static or outside history because he felt it was stuck in a theocratic unity where only the despot was truly free. Now, that is a very Eurocentric 19th century view. We should acknowledge that. However, the source argues that the structural problem Hegel identified is actually still visible today.
How so? Walk us through that.
Look at Pakistan. On paper, it is a democracy. It has a constitution, it holds elections, it has prime ministers, but the economic base of the country is largely feudal and agrarian. You have massive landowners, the zamindars, who basically own the livelihoods of thousands and thousands of people.
And this is where we get the serf analogy from the reading.
Yeah.
I found this really helpful to understand why the elections there don't seem to change anything structurally.
It cuts right to the chase. Imagine you are a serf in medieval Europe. You rely entirely on your lord for protection, for land to farm, for food to feed your family. Suddenly, someone from the city hands you a ballot and says, go vote for the best macroeconomic policy. Are you going to vote as an autonomous, rational individual?
No, you were going to vote for the guy who owns the land you sleep on.
Exactly, because you are bound by oaths and dependency and sheer survival. So in that context, an election doesn't challenge the power structure, it validates it. The source argues that in Pakistan, democracy often becomes a way to confirm bloodlines and dynastic power. You see the same families, the Bhuttos, the Sharifs, ruling for decades.
Because the consciousness of the average voter in that system is still rooted in the tribe or the family or their spiritual allegiance to a leader, not in the autonomous self that liberal democracy just assumes exists.
Precisely. The form is modern, the ballot box, but the content is feudal, the loyalty. And because there wasn't a grassroots bourgeois revolution to break those feudal ties like there was in France or England, the system just spins in place. It remains stationary.
It's like having a car with a beautiful glossy paint job, but absolutely no engine inside.
Or maybe an engine that belongs to a tractor stuffed inside a Ferrari. It just doesn't run right. The parts are fighting each other.
Okay, so that's the agrarian side of things like Pakistan, but what about the other side of the coin? The incredibly wealthy parts of the Middle East, the oil-rich Gulf states. You look at a place like Dubai or Doha, and honestly, it looks like you fast-forwarded into the future.
It really does. But the sources call this the Middle Eastern irony. You have extreme material modernity. The Burj Khalifa, Formula One circuits, the most advanced airlines in the world, coexisting with what they call an ideational void.
An ideational void. That sounds pretty heavy. What does that actually mean on the ground for the people living there?
It means the foundational ideas aren't there to match the glass and steel buildings. You have absolute monarchies and divine right kingship thriving right next to these skyscrapers. Now, in Europe, skyscrapers came after the society became secular, industrialized, and democratic. Here, the skyscrapers were just bought.
So it's borrowed modernity all over again.
It is. The source points out something really interesting about the education systems there to illustrate this. You have these shining, state-of-the-art university buildings in the Gulf, often branches of prestigious Western universities. But the critical inquiry, the questioning of authority, the radical skepticism that actually sparked the European Enlightenment is often completely missing. It is largely rote learning. It's about getting the degree without going through the dialectical struggle.
The struggle. We keep coming back to that word, Hegel's labor of the negative.
We do, because you simply cannot buy history. You can buy the products of history, you can buy the latest smartphone, the advanced MRI machine, even the parliamentary mace, but you cannot buy the social evolution and the centuries of conflict that produced them.
And in these societies, identity is still largely derived from the ummah, the broader religious community, or the tribe, or the extended family. The individual, with a capital I, is still a very abstract concept.
Right, and as long as individual freedom remains abstract, you can have all the sovereign wealth funds in the world, but you won't have the kind of self-correcting dynamic society that Hegel defines as truly free. You just have a brittle shell.
So if we zoom out and look at the whole picture we've painted today, we have gone from Captain Cook standing on the beach in 1770 to the guillotine dropping in Paris, to the British Raj in India, and now to the streets of Pakistan and the luxury towers of Dubai. The recurring theme seems to be that you cannot cheat time. You cannot bypass the hard work of history.
That is the ultimate takeaway from these texts. The source suggests we need a mindset of what it calls historical patience.
Which is incredibly hard when we look at the news and we want to fix things right now. We look at developing regions or conflict zones and think, just hold a better election, just write a better constitution.
It is incredibly hard to accept, but the lesson here is that real freedom requires organic transformation. It requires internal economic reforms that actually break the back of feudal power dynamics. It requires education that cultivates critical consciousness, not just technical job skills. It requires those mediating institutions we talked about earlier, independent unions, civil society groups, professional guilds that stand between the individual person and the absolute power of the state.
It cannot be imposed by planting a colonial flag.
And it cannot be imposed by a UN resolution or a well-meaning foreign NGO either. If the underlying social structure isn't ready to carry the heavy weight of democracy, the democracy will either collapse or turn into a complete farce. The change has to come from within the society's own struggle with its own internal contradictions.
It really makes you rethink the entire way we look at international relations and foreign policy. We are so often obsessed with asking, why aren't they like us yet?
When we really should be asking, What specific historical struggles are they going through right now? You cannot force a flower to bloom by pulling on the petals. You just destroy the flower.
That is a great analogy. I want to leave you, our listener, with a final image today. Something to really chew on after the deep dive is over.
Yeah.
Go back to that beach in Botany Bay, 1770. Imagine Captain Cook gets off the Endeavour, and instead of planting a British flag, he sets up a wooden ballot box on the sand.
Right.
And he tries to hold a democratic election among the Aboriginal clans right then and there to elect a Prime Minister of New South Wales.
It is a totally absurd image.
It is. It would be a meaningless ritual. The locals would probably just point to their elders or maybe ignore him entirely because the whole concept has no root in their reality. It wouldn't be democracy. It would be theater.
Exactly. Pure theater.
So the question for you, listening right now, to take away from all of this is this. Where else in the world today are we mistaking the appearance of modern institutions for the actual existence of freedom? Where are we watching a play and mistaking it for reality?
That is the question we all need to be asking.
Thanks for diving deep with us today.
See you next time.